The morning sunlight streamed through the half-drawn blinds of Scott Reynolds' metropolitan loft, casting elongated rectangles of light across his minimalist furniture. Everything was in its place. The sleek coffee table aligned perfectly with the edge of his designer rug, the cushions on his sofa arranged at precise, right angles. Scott had always been meticulous about his living space, perhaps to the point of neurosis, but it gave him a sense of control in a world that often felt chaotic. As a work-from-home graphic designer, his loft served as both sanctuary and office. The space had felt larger, emptier, since his sister Melissa had moved abroad 3 months ago. She'd taken a position with an international architecture firm in Tokyo, leaving Scott truly alone for the first time in his adult life. He loved his solitude, but the quiet sometimes stretched too thin, like fabric worn from overuse. It was this subtle loneliness that had finally pushed him to consider the advertisement that had been circulating on his social feeds. Interstellar Domestic Aid Services experience the galaxy's finest housekeeping. The Galactic Household Agency promised discretion, efficiency, and most intriguingly, a cultural exchange unlike any other. Earth had only been part of the interplanetary coalition for 15 years. While alien visitors were no longer shocking, having one in your home remained a novelty. Scott sipped his morning coffee while reviewing the contract on his tablet. The agency had matched him with a housekeeper named Lyra from a planet called Etheria in the Proxima Centauri system. He had minimal information about her species, beyond the basics: humanoid, omnivorous, fluent in English, and 3 other Earth languages, plus her native tongue. The contract included standard clauses about work hours, compensation, and, interestingly, a section on cultural accommodation requirements. Athenians value communal living spaces and may require additional orientation regarding Earth privacy norms, the contract read. Scott skimmed this section without much concern. He'd simply established clear boundaries from the beginning. How complicated could it be? The door chime sounded precisely at 9 a.m., and Scott straightened his already straight shirt before answering. Punctuality was a promising start. When the door slid open, Scott found himself looking at a being who was undeniably alien, yet strikingly human-like. Lyra stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall with a slender build and graceful posture. Her skin was a pale violet shade that seemed to subtly shift with the light, and her large almond-shaped eyes were a deep indigo with no visible pupils. Instead of hair, a delicate lavender-colored crest ran from her forehead, back over her scalp, rippling slightly as if responding to unseen currents. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice melodious, with an accent he couldn't quite place, slightly musical, with elongated vowels. "I am Lyra of House Thalys, Fifth Sphere. I am pleased to offer my services to your household." She gave a small bow, touching her fingertips to her crest, in what Scott assumed was a customary greeting. "Good morning, Lyra. Please call me Scott." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Welcome to my home." Lyra glided into the apartment with fluid movements, her simple gray uniform provided by the agency, contrasting with her vibrant skin tone. She carried a small case that presumably contained personal items. Her eyes moved methodically around the space, taking in every detail with quiet curiosity. "Your dwelling is most orderly," she observed. "My species appreciates harmony in living spaces. I sense you share this value." Scott felt an unexpected flush of pride at the compliment. "I like things organized. Makes it easier to work from home." "You create visual communications, correct? The agency informed me of your profession." Lyra set her case down beside the entryway bench, her movements precise and economical. "Graphic design, yes. Mostly corporate identity packages, some UI/UX work for apps." Scott noticed she had no visible ears, but rather subtle indentations on the sides of her head that seemed to pulse slightly when he spoke. "Let me show you around." The tour was brief. The open-concept main living area, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city skyline, the compact but well-equipped kitchen, his home office alcove, the guest bathroom, and finally, the short hallway leading to his bedroom, and ensuite bath. "This is your private chamber," Lyra stated, rather than asked, lingering at the threshold of his bedroom. There was something in her tone Scott couldn't quite decipher, perhaps a cultural nuance lost in translation. "Yes, exactly. Private." He emphasized the word slightly. "The agency mentioned I should be clear about Earth privacy customs. In our culture, bedrooms are personal spaces. People don't enter without permission." Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been understanding. "I comprehend. On Etheria, sleeping spaces are communal within a household. But I have studied Earth customs and will respect your boundaries." She turned to face him directly, her large eyes unblinking. "Where shall I make my rest space?" Scott blinked. He hadn't actually considered where she would sleep. The contract specified she would live in, but he had assumed the agency would have addressed accommodations. "There's a convertible sofa in my office," he said, after an awkward pause. "It pulls out into a bed. Would that be suitable?" "Any space you designate will be honored," Lyra replied, her expression serene. "Shall I prepare the morning meal while you work?" And so began their arrangement. The first day passed in a gentle rhythm of Scott working at his desk, while Lyra moved quietly through his space, occasionally asking questions about his preferences or Earth customs. By evening, his apartment was immaculate, a subtle floral scent, not quite like any Earth flower he knew lingered in the air, and Lyra had prepared a surprisingly delicious meal that incorporated familiar Earth ingredients with subtle Etherian spices. As Scott showed her how to use the convertible sofa that evening, he felt strangely self-conscious. "Will you be comfortable here? I know it's not very large." "Comfort is relative," Lyra replied, running her six-fingered hand over the bedding. "This will be adequate for my needs. Etherians require less sleep than humans, approximately 4 hours per night cycle." "What will you do with the rest of the night?" Scott asked, suddenly aware of the intimacy of having someone else moving through his space while he slept. Lyra's crest shimmered slightly. "I will enter a meditative state to process the day's observations. It is our way of integrating new experiences." She hesitated, then added, "I should inform you that my species has mild empathic abilities. We sense emotional states and body temperature fluctuations. If this makes you uncomfortable, I can wear a dampening band." Scott wasn't sure how to respond to that revelation. "Let's see how it goes. I'd like to honor your customs too, as long as they don't conflict with mine." Lyra touched her fingers to her crest again in that same greeting, or perhaps farewell gesture. "Rest well, Scott Reynolds." That night, Scott lay awake longer than usual, acutely aware of the alien presence in his home. Not unpleasantly so, just different. There was something comforting about knowing he wasn't alone yet, disconcerting to think that Lyra might be sensing his emotional state. What exactly could she detect his momentary irritation when a client email arrived late in the day? His satisfaction with the meal she'd prepared, his mild curiosity about her. Eventually sleep claimed him, and he dreamed of violet skies and musical languages he couldn't quite understand. The shock of awakening with a weight on his chest sent Scott's heart racing before his eyes had even opened. His first confused thought was that he was having a heart attack. There was pressure across his torso, warmth against his skin, and something tickling his neck. But as consciousness fully returned, he realized with a jolt that the weight was Lyra. She was draped face down across his chest, her slender body perpendicular to his, her crest brushing against his neck with each of her deep, slow breaths. She was asleep, or in whatever state passed for sleep among her species, and seemed completely at peace. Scott, however, was frozen in panic. "Lyra!" His voice came out as a choked whisper. "Lyra!" She stirred, her body shifting against his in a way that sent an unexpected wave of sensation through him. Her eyes opened immediately, the deep indigo somehow brighter in the morning light, filtering through his blinds. "Good morning, Scott Reynolds," she said calmly, as if waking up on top of her employer was perfectly normal. "What? Why?" Scott sputtered, trying to shift away without actually touching her, more than he already was. "What are you doing in my bed?" Lyra sat up, her movement graceful, despite the awkward position. She was wearing what appeared to be a simple shift of silvery material that caught the light as she moved. Scott realized with relief that they were both clothed, he in his usual t-shirt and sleep shorts. "I was sharing warmth and presence as is customary," she explained, her head tilted slightly, in apparent confusion. "Did the agency not inform you of Etherian sleep customs?" Scott sat up, pulling the sheets around himself despite being fully clothed. "No, they definitely did not mention you'd be sleeping on me." Lyra's crest flattened slightly against her head, a sign of distress, Scott guessed. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. In my culture, household members share sleeping space and body warmth as a sign of respect and care. Sleeping alone is reserved for those who are outcast or ill." She moved to the edge of the bed, her movements careful. "I should have confirmed this practice was acceptable. I have committed a cultural error." Scott ran a hand through his sleep-tousled hair, his initial shock giving way to embarrassment. He wasn't angry exactly. How could he be when she clearly hadn't intended any harm? But the intimacy of the situation left him deeply unsettled. It's okay. Just a misunderstanding." He tried to gather his thoughts. "But we need to establish some clear boundaries. In human culture, or at least in my home, we don't share beds unless we're intimate partners." "Intimate partners," Lyra repeated, as if testing the phrase. "You refer to your reproductive bonding customs." Scott felt his face grow hot. "Well, yes, partly. But it's more than that. Sharing a bed is something personal, private." "I see." Lyra's expression was earnest, her crest now rippling in what Scott was beginning to recognize as deep thought. "Among my people, physical closeness establishes trust and harmony in a household. But I will adapt to your customs." She paused, then added, "May I ask a clarifying question?" "Sure," Scott said, still feeling oddly vulnerable, sitting in his bed having this conversation. "What constitutes appropriate physical proximity in your culture? I notice humans in public spaces maintain varying distances. Some touch frequently, others avoid contact." It was a reasonable question, but Scott found himself struggling to articulate rules he'd internalized since childhood. "It's complicated. Generally, we maintain personal space, maybe arm's length unless we're close friends or family. Touching is usually limited to handshakes in professional settings, maybe hugs with friends. And in a household between dwellers of the same living space." Scott considered. "Similar rules apply, I guess. Roommates respect each other's space. Families might be more physically affectionate." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, maybe we should establish some specific guidelines for us, since we're navigating two different cultural norms." Lyra nodded, her crest rippling in apparent agreement. "A wise approach. Please dictate the parameters you prefer." They spent the next 20 minutes establishing what Scott afterwards thought of as the Lyra protocols. No entering his bedroom without permission. No physical contact beyond incidental touches when passing items or moving through the space, and most emphatically, no sharing sleeping arrangements. Clothing was to be worn at all times in common areas. Scott had added this after a momentary panic about potential Etherian nudity taboos, and Lyra agreed to give verbal signals before entering rooms to ensure Scott's privacy. Throughout this discussion, Lyra was attentive and sincere, clearly committed to understanding and respecting his boundaries. Yet Scott couldn't help noticing a subtle shift in her demeanor, a slight dimming of the luminescence of her skin, perhaps a droop to her usually erect crest. "Are these guidelines uncomfortable for you?" he asked, as they finished their negotiation over breakfast, a meal Lyra had quickly prepared while they talked. "Discomfort is not relevant," she replied, placing a cup of perfectly brewed coffee before him. "I am here to serve your household and adapt to your cultural requirements." "Yes, but this arrangement should work for both of us," Scott insisted, surprised by his own concern. "Your cultural needs matter too." Lyra's crest lifted slightly, and the violet of her skin seemed to brighten. "Your consideration honors me, Scott Reynolds. Perhaps. Perhaps we might establish a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" "On Etheria, household members participate in a daily ritual called Vashalath, approximately translated as Harmony Circle. It involves sitting in proximity, sharing breath and energy. It is not as intimate as sleep sharing, but fulfills a similar cultural function." Scott considered this. Like meditation together. Similar, though, with a physical component. Proximity within arm's reach, regulated breathing patterns. She hesitated, then added, "It helps my species maintain emotional equilibrium and physical health." Something in her explanation touched Scott. He'd hired a housekeeper, but Lyra was also a sentient being, far from home, adapting to an alien culture. The least he could do was meet her halfway. "We could try that," he agreed. "Maybe in the evening before we go to our separate sleeping spaces." The gratitude in Lyra's expression was unmistakable. "Thank you, Scott Reynolds. This accommodation means much to me." As the days passed, they settled into a rhythm that somehow worked for both of them. Lyra kept Scott's apartment immaculate prepared meals that increasingly incorporated his preferences, while introducing him to flavors from her world, and gave him space to work. Their communication grew easier as Scott learned to interpret her crest movements and skin luminescence changes, and as Lyra became more familiar with human idioms and facial expressions. The evening harmony ritual became a surprisingly pleasant part of Scott's day. They would sit cross-legged on the living room floor, facing each other with knees almost touching. Lyra would guide him through a series of breathing exercises, and they would simply exist in each other's presence for 15 minutes. Scott found it oddly centering a break from his work, a moment of quiet connection. A week into their arrangement, Scott realized something unexpected. He was enjoying Lyra's company. Not just her domestic skills or the convenience of having help around the apartment, but her presence itself. Her quiet observations about human behavior often held surprising insight, and her questions about Earth culture made him see his own world through fresh eyes. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, a collaborative effort that had evolved naturally, Scott found himself watching Lyra chop vegetables with precise, efficient movements of her six-fingered hands. "Can I ask you something personal?" he ventured. Of course. Lyra didn't look up from her task, but her crest rippled in attention. "What made you want to work on Earth? There must be easier places for an Etherian to find employment closer to home." Lyra's hands paused briefly. "I am a xenoculturalist by training. My academic focus was the study of emerging interspecies societies." She resumed, chopping her knife, making soft thuds against the cutting board. "However, academic positions on my world are political. My house lost favor in recent planetary elections, and opportunities became limited. So this is like field research for you." Her lips curved in what Scott had come to recognize as her version of a smile. "In a manner of speaking. I am learning far more about human domestic patterns through direct participation than any academic study could provide." She scooped the vegetables into a waiting pan where they sizzled pleasantly. "And you? Why invite an alien into your home when human housekeepers are available?" Scott hadn't really examined his own motivations before. "Curiosity, I suppose, and my sister moved away recently. The apartment felt too quiet." "You sought companionship as well as domestic assistance," Lyra observed. "I guess I did," Scott admitted, surprised by his own honesty. Lyra turned to face him fully, her indigo eyes meeting his. "On Etheria, we believe that households are living organisms, not merely the beings within them, but the collective entity they create together. Perhaps you sensed your household was incomplete." Something about her words resonated with Scott in an unexpected way. "Maybe so," he said softly. Later that night, as they sat for their harmony ritual, Scott noticed that Lyra had placed a small cloth pouch between them. "What's that?" he asked as they settled into position. "Pollen from the sacred blooms of my homeworld," she explained. It is used in deeper harmony rituals to enhance connection. I thought perhaps we might advance our practice if you are willing." Scott hesitated, remembering their careful boundary negotiations. "What does it involve?" "A small amount is applied to the hands and forehead. It creates a mild empathic connection, allows a better understanding of emotional states." She met his eyes directly. "It is not invasive, but it is more intimate than our current practice." Scott considered this. A month ago, he would have refused, immediately uncomfortable with the idea of anyone human or alien sensing his emotions. But something had shifted in these weeks with Lyra. There was a trust building between them that he couldn't quite explain. "Okay," he said finally, "let's try it." Lyra's crest rippled with what he now recognized as pleasure. She opened the pouch and tipped a small amount of iridescent powder into her palm. It glimmered like crushed opals, catching the light in flashes of blue and violet. "Your palm, please," she instructed. Scott held out his hand, and Lyra carefully tipped some of the powder into it. The substance was light, almost weightless, and gave off a subtle scent like vanilla and something spicier he couldn't identify. "Now apply a small amount to your forehead just above the space between your eyes." She demonstrated on herself, touching the powder delicately to her forehead, just below where her crest began. Scott mimicked her actions, feeling slightly self-conscious. The powder felt cool against his skin, then warm, then tingling slightly. "Now we touch palms," Lyra continued, holding her hand, out palm up. Scott placed his palm against hers, noting again the strange feeling of 6 fingers aligning with his 5. The moment their skin connected, he gasped. A wave of sensation washed over him, not physical exactly, but a complex tapestry of emotions that weren't his own. Curiosity, contentment, a subtle longing, appreciation, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. "Are these your feelings?" he whispered, afraid to break the delicate connection. "The pollen translates emotional states." Lyra confirmed, her voice softer than usual. "What do you perceive?" "It's hard to describe." Scott closed his eyes, focusing on the unfamiliar sensations. Warmth, curiosity, something like homesickness maybe, but also satisfaction. He opened his eyes again, meeting her gaze. "What do you feel from me?" Lyra's crest rippled slowly, her skin luminescence brightening. "Uncertainty, wonder, concern perhaps for me, and something warmer beneath." Her lips curved in that subtle smile. "Your emotions have a different texture than those of my species. More layered, complex." They remained connected for several minutes, breathing in sync as the harmony ritual dictated. Scott found himself relaxing into the strange intimacy of it, the barrier between his emotions and Lyra's becoming permeable. It wasn't mind-reading, he couldn't access her thoughts, only the emotional landscape beneath them. But it was unlike anything he had experienced with another being. When they finally broke contact, Scott felt oddly bereft, as if something precious had been withdrawn. The feeling lingered, even after they said goodnight and retired to their separate sleeping spaces. As he lay in bed that night, Scott realized with a jolt that he was attracted to Lyra. Not just intellectually curious or appreciative of her company, but genuinely physically attracted. The realization should have unsettled him. She wasn't even human, but instead, it felt like acknowledging something that had been true for some time. He drifted to sleep, wondering if she had sensed this deeper current beneath his emotions, and what she might think if she had. The next morning, Scott woke to the smell of something sweet and spicy cooking in the kitchen. He found Lyra creating what looked like pancakes, but with a purple-blue hue and an iridescent sheen, similar to the harmony pollen. "Good morning, Scott Reynolds," she greeted him, her crest rippling pleasantly. "I have prepared alva cakes, an Etherian breakfast delicacy, adapted with earth ingredients." "They smell amazing," Scott said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him, prepared exactly as he liked it, with a precise amount of cream and no sugar. He watched her move around his kitchen with graceful efficiency, noting how at home she seemed in his space now. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, then winced at the awkward reminder of their first morning's cultural misunderstanding. "My rest cycle was adequate," Lyra replied, sliding a plate of the alien pancakes before him. "And your sleep patterns, I noticed your respiration rate was elevated during the harmony ritual last night." Scott nearly choked on his coffee. Had she sensed his realization about his attraction to her? "I'm fine," he managed. "Just processing new experiences." The first exposure to empathic pollen can be intense for species unaccustomed to emotional sharing. Lyra acknowledged, sitting across from him with her own plate. "Some find it overwhelming." "Not overwhelming," Scott corrected carefully. "Just illuminating." Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been amusement. "Indeed," she gestured to his plate. "Please try the alva cakes while they are warm." The pancakes were extraordinarily light and fluffy like their Earth counterparts, but with a complex flavor that shifted from sweet to savory to something indefinable as he ate. The iridescence wasn't merely decorative. It seemed to create a sensation of effervescence on his tongue. "These are incredible," he said with genuine appreciation. "Thank you." "It pleases me to share my cultural foods with you," Lyra replied. "Perhaps later today you might teach me more about Earth breakfast traditions. I have been researching what humans call brunching. It seems to involve excessive food consumption and fermented fruit beverages." Scott laughed, struck by her earnest interest in human customs. "Brunch is more of a social event than an everyday meal. But sure, I could show you some classic Earth breakfast foods this weekend. I would value this cultural exchange." Lyra took a sip from her own cup, which contained a steaming, purplish liquid that smelled faintly of cinnamon and something alien. "Scott Reynolds, may I propose an outdoor meal experience today? Your dwelling has access to a rooftop garden, does it not? On Etheria, we believe consuming food under open sky strengthens connection to both planet and companions." The request surprised Scott, but not unpleasantly. "You mean like a picnic? Sure, we could do that for lunch. I have a conference call at 11, but I'm free after that." "Excellent. I shall prepare appropriate provisions." Lyra's crest rippled with what Scott had come to recognize as enthusiasm. "Is there an Earth picnic protocol I should observe?" "Not really. Just food that's easy to eat outdoors. Maybe a blanket to sit on." He found himself looking forward to the outing more than he would have expected. The rooftop garden was one of the building's best amenities, a carefully landscaped space with herb beds, flowering plants, and comfortable seating areas, all overlooking the city skyline. Scott rarely took advantage of it, always too busy with work or too accustomed to his indoor routine. But as he and Lyra settled onto a blanket she had brought, where had she found that he wondered why he didn't come up here more often? Lyra had prepared an impressive spread, small sandwiches with flavors both familiar and alien fruits, cut into precise geometric shapes, and 2 glass bottles of a pale golden liquid that Scott didn't recognize. "This is sun-brewed Novala," Lyra explained, pouring the liquid into cups she had brought. "An Etherian refreshment. It is non-intoxicating but has mood-elevating properties, similar to your Earth chocolate." Scott accepted the cup cautiously, sniffing the contents. It smelled like honey and spring flowers with an undercurrent of something spicier. He took a small sip and was rewarded with a burst of flavor that somehow reminded him of sunshine itself, warm, bright, and uplifting. "Wow," he said, taking another sip. "That's unlike anything I've tasted before." "Novala is traditionally served during courtship rituals," Lyra said, casually selecting a sandwich triangle. "It is said to lower inhibitions just enough to allow honest communication without clouding judgment." Scott nearly choked on his drink. Courtship rituals. Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been embarrassment. "Forgive me, that was not an appropriate cultural reference. I meant simply that it is served when people wish to know one another better." "Right." Scott felt his face warming and not from the sun overhead. Well, it's delicious. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, enjoying the gentle breeze and the distant sounds of the city below. Scott found himself studying Lyra's profile as she gazed out at the skyline. The elegant curve of her crest, the subtle luminescence of her violet skin in the sunlight, the graceful line of her neck. "May I ask you a personal question, Scott Reynolds?" Lyra broke the silence, turning to face him directly. "Of course," he replied, setting his cup down. "Human dwelling patterns confuse me. You live alone in a space designed for multiple inhabitants. You expressed emptiness when your sister departed, yet you maintain rigid boundaries and privacy customs." Her head tilted slightly. "Do humans not experience isolation distress?" The directness of the question caught Scott off guard. "We do," he admitted after a moment's consideration. "Some more than others, I guess. I've always valued my independence, my space. But yes, sometimes it gets lonely." On Etheria, aloneness is considered a temporary state, useful for reflection, but harmful if prolonged. Lyra's indigo eyes studied him with gentle curiosity. Even unrelated Etherians form household units. Solitary dwelling is rare. "Humans are complicated," Scott said with a small smile. "We want connection, but we also want autonomy. Sometimes those desires conflict." "And which do you prefer, Scott Reynolds' connection or autonomy?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Scott wasn't sure Lyra intended. Before he could formulate a response, a gust of wind swept across the rooftop garden, sending their napkins flying. They both reached to catch them, and Scott's hand brushed against Lyra's. The contact was brief, but electric. Without the harmony pollen, he couldn't sense her emotions directly, but something passed between them in that touch. A recognition, perhaps, or a possibility. Lyra's crest rippled rapidly, and the violet of her skin deepened noticeably. "Your body temperature has elevated," she observed softly. "Is this distress or another state?" Scott swallowed suddenly, very aware of their proximity on the picnic blanket. "Not distress," he managed to say. "I see." Lyra's voice had taken on a slightly musical quality, her accent more pronounced. "On Etheria, such temperature changes often indicate interest." "It's not so different for humans," Scott admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Lyra's gaze held his, her large indigo eyes unblinking. "Scott Reynolds, I believe we may be experiencing a cultural convergence rather than a misunderstanding." The moment stretched between them fragile and charged with possibility. Scott found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Lyra remained perfectly still, but her crest rippled in what he now recognized as anticipation. The shrill ring of Scott's phone shattered the moment. He jerked back, fumbling for the device in his pocket. "I'm sorry, I need to—" "Of course," Lyra said smoothly, already beginning to pack up their picnic with efficient movements. "We should return to your dwelling. You have work obligations." Scott answered the call, a client with a last-minute revision request, while helping Lyra gather their things, but his mind was elsewhere. What had almost happened between them, and what would it mean if it had? As they headed back to the apartment, Scott caught Lyra watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity mixed with something deeper, more complex. Her crest rippled gently, and for a moment he wished he had some of that harmony pollen to bridge the gap between them, to understand what she was feeling. The next few days brought a subtle shift in their interactions. Nothing was explicitly acknowledged, but there was a new awareness between them, a careful dance of proximity and distance. Their evening harmony rituals became longer, more intense. Lyra introduced new elements, scented oils from her homeworld soft vocalizations that resonated in Scott's chest positions, that brought them incrementally closer, without quite touching. Scott found himself looking forward to these sessions with an eagerness that surprised him. He began asking more questions about Etherian culture, particularly relationship customs. Lyra answered openly, explaining the complex social structures of her world, how households formed and reformed, based on compatibility rather than biological kinship, how empathic bonding created family units that transcended species boundaries in their interplanetary society. So, Etherians form romantic relationships with other species? Scott asked one evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner. Romantic is a human concept, Lyra replied, her hands busy, with a small weaving she had begun in her free time. We form bonds of various intensities and purposes. Some are practical, others emotional, many involve physical components. Her eyes met his briefly. Interspecies households have become more common since joining the coalition. Compatibility is determined by empathic resonance, not biological similarity. And how is that compatibility measured? Scott tried to keep his tone casual, though his heart rate had picked up. Lyra's crest rippled knowingly. Initially through empathic testing, similar to our harmony ritual with the pollen. More profound compatibility is assessed through a series of shared experiences. She set her weaving aside. Scott Reynolds, are you asking if Etherians and humans can form pair bonds? The directness of her question startled a laugh from him. I guess I am, yeah. The answer is yes, though it is not common. Her violet skin seemed to glow more intensely in the dimming evening light. Such unions require significant cultural adaptation from both participants. I imagine they would, Scott murmured suddenly, very aware of the narrow space between them on the sofa. Lyra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable to his human eyes. We should prepare for our harmony ritual, she said finally. I have brought a new element I believe you might find illuminating. That night's ritual was different from the start. Lyra arranged cushions on the floor, in a pattern she explained was traditional on her world, creating a small, intimate space that seemed separate from the rest of the apartment. She lit several small objects that weren't quite candles, but gave off a similar soft light, and a scent like nothing on earth, part floral, part spice, part something entirely alien, but not unpleasant. Tonight, we will use a higher grade of empathic pollen, she explained, as they settled onto the cushions closer than their usual positioning. It creates a deeper connection, allowing for the sharing of not just emotions, but simple sensory experiences. Scott felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. Is it safe? Completely. It has been used in interspecies diplomacy for decades, without incident. She held out the now familiar pouch. However, it is more intimate. You may decline if you are uncomfortable. Scott considered for only a moment before holding out his palm. I trust you, Lyra. Her crest rippled in a way he had come to associate with pleasure. That trust honors me. This pollen was different, more iridescent, shifting through colors, like an oil slick in sunlight. It felt warmer against his skin, the tingling sensation, more pronounced when he applied it to his forehead. When Lyra took his hands in hers, both hands this time, not just palm to palm, the connection hit him like a wave. Emotions flowed between them, more vivid than before: Lyra's fascination and increasing affection for him, her scientific curiosity about human customs, her growing sense of belonging in his home. But beyond emotions came flashes of sensation, the world through Lyra's eyes, where colors had dimensions he couldn't name. Sounds carried tactile qualities, and the air itself seemed alive with information his human senses couldn't process. This is how you see the world, he whispered, overwhelmed by the complexity of her perceptions. A simplified version, Lyra murmured, her voice seeming to come from both outside and inside his mind simultaneously. And I am experiencing yours so focused, so specific. You notice details I would miss, patterns my mind doesn't prioritize. They sat in this shared perception for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, exploring the overlapping and divergent ways they experienced reality. Scott felt boundaries dissolving, not uncomfortably, but like ice melting into water. Still the same substance, but in a different form. When Lyra finally broke the connection, releasing his hands gently, Scott felt momentarily disoriented, as if he had been in two places at once, and now was confined to a single location. That was... He struggled to find words adequate to the experience. Yes, Lyra agreed, her crest rippling in slow waves, her skin glowing more intensely than he had ever seen before. Scott Reynolds, I must inform you that such deep empathic sharing is considered significant among my people. It is not a casual interaction. Scott held her gaze, feeling braver than he had in years. It's not casual for me either. The admission hung between them, charging the air with possibility. Lyra's crest rippled rapidly, and she leaned forward slightly, her six-fingered hand reaching toward his face with exquisite slowness. Scott remained perfectly still, heart-pounding, as her cool fingers made contact with his cheek in a feather-light caress. Without the pollen, he couldn't sense her emotions directly, but her touch conveyed volumes: question, invitation, affection. Scott turned his face slightly into her palm, accepting what she offered. Human customs in such moments are not clear to me, Lyra said softly. How do you proceed when mutual interest is established? Scott smiled, covering her hand with his own. Usually, something like this, he murmured, leaning forward to close the distance between them. Their first kiss was tentative, exploratory. Lyra's lips were cooler than a human's, slightly firmer, and carried a faint taste like cinnamon and starlight. Her crest brushed against his forehead, creating a tingling sensation where it made contact. When they parted, her indigo eyes were wide, her crest fully extended in what Scott had learned, indicated intense emotion. This touching of oral membranes, she said, her voice slightly breathless. It has deeper significance than I realized from Earth media. The sensory feedback is complex. Scott couldn't help laughing, not at her, but at the perfect alienness of her scientific observation, mixed with obvious pleasure. That's one way to describe kissing, he agreed, stroking a finger lightly along the edge of her crest, which rippled at his touch. Was it a good complex? Most definitely, Lyra affirmed, leaning into his touch like a cat. I wish to explore this practice further, if you are willing. What followed was both tender and amusing, a careful exploration of interspecies affection, with occasional pauses for Lyra to ask questions or make observations about human physiology and responses. Scott discovered that her crest was highly sensitive, that the luminescence of her skin intensified with pleasure, and that the faint patterns visible beneath her violet epidermis shifted and flowed with her emotions. They didn't progress beyond kissing and gentle touches that night, both silently acknowledging they were crossing boundaries that required care and consideration. When they finally parted to their separate sleeping spaces, Scott felt lighter than he had in years, as if some tension he hadn't known he carried had finally released. Good night, Lyra, he said as they stood in the hallway between his bedroom and the office where she slept. Rest well, Scott Reynolds, she replied, touching her fingers to her crest, and then, in a gesture that made his heart skip to his forehead, a melding of her cultural greeting with something more intimate. As Scott lay in bed that night replaying the evening's events, he realized their relationship had fundamentally changed. Lyra was no longer just his housekeeper, nor merely a fascinating alien presence in his home. She had become something else entirely, a companion, perhaps a partner. The thought should have terrified him with all its implications and complications, but instead, he felt only a quiet certainty that they were navigating this uncharted territory together. The next morning, Scott woke to find Lyra sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his bed. Her eyes closed, her crest rippling gently, in what he recognized as her meditative state. She wasn't touching him, respecting the boundaries they had established weeks earlier, but her presence in his room was new. Lyra, he murmured, propping himself up on one elbow. Her eyes opened immediately, indigo depths, focusing on him with that direct gaze that still, sometimes unnerved him. Good morning, Scott Reynolds. I hope my presence does not disturb you. I wished to be near when you woke. It's fine, he assured her, surprised to find he meant it. Is everything okay? Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been hesitation. I am uncertain. During my meditation cycle, I became aware of a physiological anomaly. I believe we should consult a medical professional with interspecies expertise. Scott sat up, fully concerned, washing over him. Are you sick? What's wrong? Not illness, precisely. Lyra's skin luminescence pulsed, in a pattern he couldn't interpret. It is. Perhaps it would be best to seek diagnosis before speculating. Her careful evasion only heightened Scott's worry. He threw back the covers, already reaching for his phone. I'll call the Interplanetary Health Center. They should be able to see us today. The Interplanetary Health Center occupied a gleaming tower in the city's medical district, its architecture an elegant blend of Earth design principles and alien aesthetics that reflected its diverse clientele. Scott and Lyra sat in a waiting area designed to accommodate beings of vastly different physiologies, the ambient temperature and lighting shifting subtly in cycles to provide comfort to as many species as possible. Scott couldn't stop his leg from bouncing nervously as they waited. Lyra placed a cool hand on his knee, stilling the movement. Your anxiety is unnecessary, she assured him, her voice calm. I am experiencing no distress or pain. Then, what is it? Scott pressed, keeping his voice low. You've been so vague about these anomalies. Before Lyra could respond, a voice called her name, and they were ushered into an examination room by a human nurse with bright green hair and a professional smile. Dr. Theron will be with you shortly, the nurse informed them, scanning Lyra with a handheld device that emitted a soft humming sound. I'm just taking preliminary readings. The device beeped, and the nurse's eyes widened slightly as she read the display. She maintained her professional demeanor, but Scott caught the quick glance she shot between him and Lyra. The doctor will be in momentarily, she said, her tone carefully neutral as she exited the room. What was that about? Scott asked, as soon as the door closed. Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been amusement. I believe the nurse has detected what I suspected. Before Scott could demand clarification, the door opened again to admit Dr. Theron, a tall, willowy being with translucent bluish skin and 4 arms dressed in medical whites, with glowing insignia that presumably indicated their credentials. Good morning, Dr. Theron greeted them in accented but precise English. Their voice had a musical quality, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. I am Dr. Theron, xenobiological specialist. I understand we have an unusual situation to evaluate. My housekeeper, Lyra, says she's experiencing some kind of anomaly. Scott explained, his anxiety spiking again. But she wouldn't tell me what it is. Dr. Theron's large, pupilless eyes blinked horizontally as they studied the readout on a tablet-like device. I see. And how long have you two been in a pair-bonded relationship? Scott choked on air. We're not. We only just... Approximately 3 Earth weeks since initial empathic connection, Lyra supplied calmly. More intensive bonding began recently. Dr. Theron nodded, as if this confirmed something. And you've engaged in sleep-sharing body temperature regulation rituals. Scott's face felt hot. There was one morning when, wait, what does this have to do with Lyra's health issue? Dr. Theron set the tablet down and regarded them both with an expression Scott couldn't interpret on their alien features. I believe congratulations are in order, they said. You are experiencing a very rare phenomenon, a viable cross-species conception. The room seemed to tilt around Scott. A what? Conception, Dr. Theron repeated. Lyra is carrying an embryonic life form that contains genetic material from both of you. That's impossible, Scott blurted. We haven't even, we only kissed, we didn't... Etherian reproduction does not always require what humans would consider sexual intercourse, Dr. Theron explained patiently. Under specific conditions, close physical proximity, during sleep cycles, empathic bonding, the exchange of certain biochemical markers present, In Etherian skin secretions, genetic material can be transferred without typical reproductive acts. Scott turned to Lyra, who was watching him with those large indigo eyes, her crest rippling slowly. "You knew," he realized. "That's why you wanted the medical confirmation." "I suspected," she corrected gently. "My species can sense conceptive changes very early. But cross-species conception is so rare, I could not be certain without medical verification." Scott's mind whirled with implications, questions, fears. Is the baby, will it be okay? Is Lyra in danger? How is this even possible? Dr. Theron raised two of their four hands in a calming gesture. Genetically compatible interspecies conceptions are rare but documented. Etherian biology is remarkably adaptive, and human genetic material is more universally compatible than most species. They picked up the tablet again, studying the readings. The embryo appears stable with genetic contributions from both parents, forming a viable hybrid pattern. However, there are protocols that must be followed for such an unusual pregnancy. "Protocols," Scott echoed weakly. "Etherian cultural requirements." Lyra explained, her voice taking on a formal quality Scott hadn't heard before. "For any conception outside established pair bonds, a clan acknowledgement ceremony must be performed." "This is correct," Dr. Theron confirmed. "Additionally, from a medical perspective, we will need to establish specialized prenatal care. Etherian gestation is significantly accelerated compared to human pregnancy, approximately 3 Earth months from conception to birth." Scott felt as if he might need to sit down, except he was already sitting. 3 months, and how far along is... "Based on these readings, approximately 2 Earth weeks," Dr. Theron replied. "The embryo is developing at the expected rate for an Etherian-human hybrid. We should schedule regular monitoring, but there are no immediate concerns." Scott looked at Lyra, struggling to process everything. "Are you okay with this? I mean, this isn't what you signed up for when you took a housekeeping job." Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been gentle amusement. "In Etherian culture, conceptions are viewed as gifts from the universe, unexpected, but always welcome. I am not distressed." She hesitated, then added more softly, "However, I understand human perspectives differ. This situation places no obligation upon you." Something in her measured tone, the careful way she was watching him, made Scott reach for her hand. "I'm shocked," he admitted, "but I'm not. I don't want to walk away from this. From you." The truth of it surprised him even as he said it. The luminescence of Lyra's skin brightened visibly, and her crest rippled in what Scott now recognized as joy. "Your response honors me, Scott Reynolds." Dr. Theron made a sound that might have been the equivalent of clearing their throat. "There is one more matter of immediate concern. Etherian cultural protocols require that the clan blessing ceremony be conducted within 3 days of confirmed conception. Without it, the pregnancy may face complications." "What kind of ceremony?" Scott asked, still holding Lyra's hand. A formal acknowledgement by Lyra's clan that you are accepted as a genetic contributor," Dr. Theron explained. "It typically involves meeting with clan elders and participating in ritual challenges to demonstrate worthiness." "Challenges," Scott repeated, a new anxiety blooming. Symbolic combat is traditional," Lyra said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Usually with the parent or guardian of the gestating partner." Scott blinked. "Combat like fighting." "Ritual combat," Lyra clarified, as if that made it better. "With ceremonial energy blades. It is largely symbolic, though skill and courage are evaluated." "And this needs to happen within 3 days," Scott confirmed, feeling slightly faint. "Fortunately," Dr. Theron interjected, "Lyra's clan vessel is currently in Earth orbit. I took the liberty of notifying them of your situation's standard protocol for interspecies conceptions involving diplomatic species like Etherians. They have already requested docking permission at the interplanetary embassy." Scott looked from Dr. Theron to Lyra, and back again, trying to absorb the rapid escalation of his life circumstances. In the span of an hour, he had gone from being a man with an alien girlfriend to an expectant father preparing to face ritual combat with alien in-laws. "I guess we should prepare," he managed weakly. Lyra's crest rippled in what might have been sympathy. "I will guide you through the protocols, Scott Reynolds. My clan is progressive by Etherian standards. The combat ritual is unlikely to result in serious injury." "That's reassuring," Scott replied, not feeling reassured at all. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparations. Lyra received a series of communications from her clan vessel, and their apartment was soon filled with holographic projections of stern-looking Etherians, with elaborate crests and ceremonial attire speaking rapidly in their musical language, while Lyra translated and explained human customs in return. Scott, meanwhile, found himself taking crash courses in Etherian ceremonial combat from instructional programs Lyra downloaded to his tablet. The basics weren't completely alien. The energy blades functioned somewhat like fencing foils combined with lightweight sabers, and the combat itself followed ritualized patterns, more like a dance than actual warfare. Still, the idea of facing Lyra's father, a high-ranking member of Etherian society, in any kind of combat, made Scott's palms sweat. "The purpose is not to win," Lyra explained, as she watched him practice lunges in their living room furniture, pushed aside to create space. "It is to demonstrate courage, respect for tradition, and commitment to the offspring." "So losing is okay?" Scott asked, hopefully accidentally scorching a small mark on the wall with the practice blade Lyra had fabricated for him. "Losing with dignity is acceptable," Lyra clarified, her crest rippling in what might have been amusement. "Fleeing or surrendering immediately would be problematic." Scott groaned, making another awkward lunge. "Great, no pressure." The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear. Scott had barely slept, his mind racing with everything Lyra had taught him about Etherian protocols, clan hierarchy, and proper forms of address. They were to meet her clan's delegation at the Interplanetary Embassy's ceremonial hall at midday. Lyra entered his bedroom, their boundaries long since renegotiated, carrying a bundle of shimmering fabric. Traditional attire for the non-Etherian partner, she explained, unfolding what appeared to be a tunic and loose pants, made of a material that shifted colors like mother of pearl. "It signifies your transitional status, not yet clan, but no longer separate." Scott accepted the garments, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. I want to do this right, Lyra. For you and for—" He gestured vaguely toward her midsection, still struggling to fully comprehend the life growing within her. Lyra's expression softened, her crest rippling gently. "You honor us both with your commitment, Scott Reynolds." She touched her fingers to her crest, then to his forehead, in what had become their private gesture of affection. "Whatever happens today, know that you have already shown great courage by accepting this unexpected path." The Interplanetary Embassy was a marvel of collaborative architecture, a soaring structure of crystal living plants and flowing water designed to welcome beings from across the coalition. The ceremonial hall, reserved for their use, had been arranged according to Etherian traditions, with a circular platform at the center, surrounded by tiered seating. Scott felt distinctly underdressed, despite his ceremonial garments, as they were led into the hall by a multi-species diplomatic team. The assembled Etherians were resplendent in elaborate attire, their crests adorned with metallic ornaments that caught the light, their violet skin decorated with swirling patterns in luminescent paint. At the center of the delegation stood a tall, imposing Etherian, whose crest was larger and more elaborate than the others. The patterns on his skin were more intricate, and the ceremonial armor he wore gleamed with embedded lights that pulsed in rhythm with his breathing. "My father, Elder Thalas of the Fifth Sphere," Lyra murmured to Scott as they approached. "Address him as honored elder and await his acknowledgement before speaking further." Scott swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of his human limitations in this alien ceremony. The elder's indigo eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Scott feel as if he were being scanned at the cellular level. "Honored elder." Scott said, bowing as Lyra had taught him. I am Scott Reynolds of Earth. I stand before you as genetic contributor to your clan's newest member. The formal phrasing felt strange on his tongue, but Lyra had insisted it was the proper introduction. Elder Thalas studied him for what felt like an eternity before responding in heavily accented but clear English. Scott Reynolds of Earth, you claim the right of genetic contribution without proper clan negotiation or bonding ceremony. His crest rippled in what Scott hoped was thoughtfulness rather than anger. This is unconventional. The universe offers gifts in unexpected forms. Honored Father, Lyra interjected, stepping forward to touch her crest in formal greeting. As our teachings proclaim, life finds synthesis across the void. The elder's expression softened slightly as he regarded his daughter. Indeed, Lyra of House Thalas. And how do you perceive this unexpected synthesis? With joy and wonder, Honored Father. Lyra replied, her voice steady, but her crest rippling with emotion. Scott Reynolds is worthy of clan consideration, though our paths crossed through unconventional means. Elder Thalas turned his attention back to Scott, his indigo eyes unreadable. The worthiness of an unexpected contributor must be demonstrated through the ancient rites. Are you prepared to undertake the challenge of intent, Scott Reynolds of Earth? Scott straightened his shoulders, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. I am honored, Elder. A ripple of what might have been approval, or possibly amusement, passed through the assembled Etherians. Elder Thalas gestured, and two attendants approached bearing ceremonial cases. They opened to reveal the energy blades Scott had been practicing with, though these were far more elaborate than his practice weapon with crystalline hilts and blades that shimmered with contained energy. The challenge of intent is not mere combat, Elder Thalas explained as the attendants presented the weapons. It is a dialogue of purpose, a demonstration that you understand the gravity of genetic contribution to our clan. Scott nodded, accepting the offered blade with as much ceremony as he could muster. Its weight was surprisingly lighter than he expected, with a perfect balance that made it feel like an extension of his arm, rather than a separate object. Elder Thalas took his position at the opposite side of the circular platform, his own blade igniting with a sound like singing crystal. Begin when ready, Scott Reynolds of Earth. Show us your intent. Scott took a deep breath, centering himself as Lyra had taught him. He activated his blade, which hummed to life with a blue-white energy that made the air around it shimmer. The first positions of the ritual were clear in his mind. Approach, salute, initial defensive stance. He stepped forward, executed what he hoped was a passable Etherian salute, and raised his blade in the opening position. Elder Thalas mirrored his movements with fluid grace, his expression focused but not hostile. The first exchange was tentative, Scott moving through the patterns he had practiced, Elder Thalas responding with controlled precision. The energy blades hummed and crackled when they connected, sending vibrations up Scott's arm, but causing no pain. It was as Lyra had described, more dance than battle, a stylized communication of purpose and respect. As they moved through the ritual, Scott began to understand its deeper meaning. Each stance represented an aspect of parenthood, protection, guidance, sacrifice, joy. The exchanges weren't about domination, but demonstration, showing that he comprehended the responsibility he was claiming. Elder Thalas gradually increased the complexity and speed of his movements, testing Scott's adaptability and commitment. Scott stumbled several times, but recovered, focusing not on winning, but on completing each pattern with sincerity. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the challenge continued, the physical exertion intense, despite the ritualized nature of the combat. Just as Scott felt his arms beginning to truly tire, something unexpected happened. Lyra, who had been watching from the edge of the platform, suddenly doubled over with a gasp. Her skin flared with intense luminescence, and her crest extended, fully rippling in rapid waves. The quickening comes, called one of the Etherian elders, their voice filled with what sounded like surprise and wonder. Elder Thalas immediately lowered his blade, the ritual combat forgotten. How is this possible? The gestation has barely begun. Scott deactivated his blade, rushing to Lyra's side. What's happening? Are you okay? Dr. Theron, who had been observing from nearby, hurried forward with a scanning device. Extraordinary, they murmured after passing the device over Lyra's midsection. The hybrid embryo is developing at an unprecedented rate. It appears the combination of human and Etherian genetic material has created a unique growth pattern. Lyra looked up at Scott, her indigo eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and what might have been joy. The child comes Scott Reynolds. Now. Now, Scott repeated, panic rising. But Dr. Theron said 3 months. Interspecies conceptions can be unpredictable, Dr. Theron admitted, still scanning Lyra. This appears to be a case of accelerated development triggered by the ritual energies. The hybrid embryo is responding to the concentrated familial presence and ceremonial context. Elder Thalas had moved to his daughter's side, his expression now openly concerned. The conception ritual and birthright must be combined, he declared, looking to the other Etherian elders. Prepare the energy matrix. What followed was a flurry of activity that Scott could barely comprehend. The Etherians moved with practiced efficiency, rearranging the ceremonial space and producing various crystalline objects from containers they had brought. Lyra was helped to the center of the platform, where a nest-like arrangement of shimmering fabric had been hastily assembled. Scott Reynolds. Elder Thalas addressed him formally, though his tone had lost some of its ceremonial stiffness. Your challenge is now of a different nature. The child comes in the midst of the recognition ritual, a rare occurrence our traditions interpret as most auspicious. You must now participate in the unified creation ceremony. What do I need to do? Scott asked, all thoughts of protocol forgotten in his concern for Lyra. Join your energy with ours, Elder Thalas explained, gesturing to where several Etherians were forming a circle around Lyra. The birth matrix requires the presence of both genetic contributors and clan elders. Scott took his place in the circle, following the gestures of those around him. The Etherians each held one of the crystalline objects, which had begun to glow, with an inner light that matched the luminescence of their skin. An attendant pressed a similar crystal into Scott's hands. It felt warm, and seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Focus your intent toward Lyra and the child, Elder Thalas instructed. The matrix amplifies biological harmony. Scott tried to do as instructed, concentrating on Lyra's face, as she breathed deeply, her crest fully extended and rippling like waves in a storm. The crystal in his hands grew warmer, its light intensifying, until it matched the glow emanating from Lyra herself. The Etherians began a harmonic vocalization, not quite singing, but a resonant humming that seemed to vibrate through Scott's very bones. He felt a strange connection forming, similar to the empathic bond he had experienced with Lyra during their harmony rituals, but magnified, extended to include everyone in the circle. Through this connection, he sensed Lyra's experience. Not pain exactly, but an intense pressure and energy building within her. He instinctively pushed supportive thoughts toward her, and her eyes found his, across the circle filled with gratitude and something deeper. The humming grew louder, the light from the crystals brighter, until the entire circle seemed encased in a dome of shimmering energy. Lyra's body was now glowing so intensely that Scott could barely look directly at her, though he refused to turn away. The air tingled with electricity, and Scott felt as if they were suspended in a moment outside normal time and space. With a final surge of light and sound, the energy peaked, and then suddenly, there was a new presence within the circle. A small, perfect being materialized within the curve of Lyra's arms, as if condensing from the light itself. The infant had violet skin several shades lighter than Lyra's, with a subtle luminescence that pulsed with its rapid heartbeat. A delicate crest, more like soft down than the adult Etherian structure, covered its head. But the shape of its face, the 5-fingered hands, and something indefinable about its features, were unmistakably influenced by Scott's human genetics. The harmonic humming softened to a gentle chorus as the energy matrix gradually dissipated. Scott found himself moving forward without conscious thought, drawn to Lyra and their child by an instinct that transcended species. "A son," Lyra said softly, as Scott knelt beside her. "Healthy and strong. See how his light pulses?" Scott reached out a trembling hand, and the infant immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength. A surge of emotion unlike anything he had ever experienced washed over him, a protective love so fierce and immediate that it took his breath away. "He's perfect," Scott whispered, his voice unsteady. "How is this possible?" "The universe finds a way," Elder Thalys said from behind him, his formal tone replaced by something warmer, almost grandfatherly. "Even across the void between worlds." The next hours passed in a blur of ceremonial acknowledgments, medical examinations, and quiet moments of wonder. The Etherian delegation formally recognized Scott as clan-connected, a status that apparently carried significant diplomatic privileges he was too overwhelmed to fully understand. Dr. Theron performed thorough scans of both Lyra and the infant, pronouncing both in excellent health, despite the unprecedented nature of the birth. "He exhibits a fascinating blend of both species' characteristics," Dr. Theron explained, as they conducted their examination. "Etherian empathic structures combined with human neurological patterns. Accelerated development typical of Etherian infants, but with human immunological adaptations. He is quite literally the first of his kind." Scott hardly heard the medical details, too captivated by the small being who now slept peacefully in Lyra's arms. The child they would need to decide on a name, he realized belatedly, seemed to glow softly when either of them touched him, his tiny crest rippling in dreams. "A naming ceremony must be scheduled," Elder Thalys informed them as the formal proceedings concluded. "Traditionally within 7 days. Will Earth customs allow for this?" Scott nodded, still somewhat dazed. "Yes, of course. Whatever traditions are important." "Both traditions are important," Lyra corrected gently. "Our son bridges 2 worlds. He should honor both lineages." "Yes," Scott agreed, finding his voice. "Both traditions matter. We'll find a way to honor everything Etherian, naming ceremonies and Earth celebrations." Elder Thalys's crest rippled in what Scott was beginning to recognize as approval. "You understand already a fundamental truth of interspecies parenting, Scott Reynolds of Earth. This bodes well." He touched his fingers to his crest in formal acknowledgement. "The clan vessel must depart on diplomatic business, but we shall return for the naming ceremony. Until then, you are under clan protection and recognition." As the Etherian delegation prepared to depart, Scott found himself standing with Lyra and their son near the large windows of the embassy, looking out at the city skyline. The absurdity of his situation struck him suddenly, how a simple decision to hire an alien housekeeper had, in the span of weeks, completely transformed his life. "Are you experiencing regret, Scott Reynolds?" Lyra asked softly, sensing his mood without needing empathic pollen. "Not regret," Scott replied honestly. "Amazement. I never imagined my life could change so completely so quickly. It's overwhelming, but in a good way." He looked down at their son sleeping peacefully against Lyra's chest. "I didn't know I could feel like this." Lyra's free hand found his, her 6 fingers intertwining with his 5, in what now felt like a perfectly natural fit. "On Etheria, we have a saying. The universe arranges molecules in patterns too complex for minds to predict." Her crest rippled gently. "I believe our pattern, unexpected as it is, has a purpose." Scott squeezed her hand gently. "I think you're right." The journey home was surreal. Scott, Lyra, and their newborn son traveling by autonomous vehicle through a city that seemed somehow both the same and entirely different from the one Scott had known his whole life. The apartment that had once felt empty after his sister's departure, then comfortably shared with Lyra, now took on a new dimension as they carried their child over the threshold. "We'll need baby supplies," Scott realized suddenly, the practical aspects of parenthood hitting him. A crib clothes whatever the Etherean equivalent of diapers is. The clan has arranged for traditional necessities to be delivered, Lyra assured him, gently placing their sleeping son on a pile of cushions she quickly arranged on the sofa. And I believe your sister left some items in storage when she departed. You mentioned baby gear from her friend's children. Right, yes, Scott remembered. She stored some baby things when her friend moved abroad. I think there's a portable crib at least. He ran a hand through his hair, still struggling to process the day's events. I can't believe this is happening. Lyra studied him with those deep indigo eyes. Are you distressed? No, Scott answered honestly. Overwhelmed, yes, but not distressed. He moved to stand beside her, looking down at their son. He needs a name. In Etherean tradition, a child bears names from both parental lineages, Lyra explained. The formal naming ceremony establishes these connections, but we may choose a daily use name now if you wish. Scott thought for a moment. What about Orion? It's a constellation visible from both Earth and Etheria, according to what you told me. A pattern of stars that connects our worlds. Lyra's crest rippled appreciatively. Orion, she repeated the name musical in her accent. It is appropriate. A bridge between worlds. She reached down to gently touch the infant's cheek, which glowed faintly at her contact. Orion of House Thalys and House Reynolds. As if recognizing his name, the baby's eyes fluttered open indigo like Lyra's, but with distinct pupils, like Scott's. His tiny crest rippled, and a soft cooing sound escaped him. He knows his name already, Scott marveled. Etherean infants are born with more developed awareness than human babies, Lyra explained. Though I suspect the human influence will affect his development patterns in ways we cannot predict. We'll figure it out together, Scott promised, slipping an arm around her waist. Day by day. The following weeks brought a crash course in interspecies parenting. Orion grew at an accelerated rate compared to human infants, already showing remarkable awareness and responsiveness by the end of his first week. His needs were a unique blend of both species. He required the harmony rituals that sustained Etherians, but also the physical closeness and nutrition that human babies needed. The promised naming ceremony brought Elder Thalys and a smaller delegation back to Earth, where Orion was formally recognized by both the Etherian Clan Registry and Earth's Interspecies Citizen Bureau. The ceremony itself was a beautiful melding of traditions, Etherian harmonics, and crystal light rituals combined with elements of Earth, naming celebrations that Scott's sister, returned briefly from Tokyo for the occasion, helped arrange. As the formal procedures concluded, Scott found himself standing on the rooftop garden of his building, the same place where he and Lyra had shared their first picnic, holding his son, while Lyra conversed with her father nearby. The morning sunlight cast the city in a golden glow, and Orion's tiny crest rippled with delight at the sensation of fresh air and natural light. Who would have thought, Scott murmured to his son, that hiring a housekeeper would lead to this? Life is full of unexpected turns, said a voice behind him. Scott turned to find Elder Thalys approaching his formal ceremonial attire, replaced by simpler robes. Honored Elder. Scott acknowledged with a small bow of his head, careful not to disturb Orion. You may address me as father-kin now, the elder corrected with a ripple of his crest. The formal bonds have been established. He gazed at his grandson with unmistakable affection. He flourishes under your care. We're learning as we go, Scott admitted. Everything is new territory. As it should be, Elder Thalys replied. The first explorations of any new world are always uncertain. He fixed Scott with those penetrating indigo eyes. You have surprised our clan, Scott Reynolds. Few non-Etherians adapt so readily to our ways. Lyra has been patient with me, Scott said, glancing over at her, where she stood speaking with her clan members. She caught his eye, and her crest rippled in a private greeting. She's made it easy to learn. And you have given her something equally valuable, Elder Thalys observed. A home bridging worlds where neither of you must fully abandon your nature to accommodate the other. His crest rippled thoughtfully. Such balanced households are rare and precious in our expanding universe. Before Scott could respond, Lyra joined them, her hand automatically finding Scott's, in that now familiar gesture of connection. "The clan ship departs soon, honored father," she said. "Will you join us for the final meal?" Elder Thalos inclined his head. "With pleasure, daughter." As they turned to head inside, Scott caught Lyra's eye. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. "More than okay," she assured him, her crest rippling happily. "My father has formally recognized our household in clan records, a significant honor for an interspecies family." Scott felt a surge of pride, mixed with gratitude. "We've come a long way from cultural misunderstandings, haven't we?" Lyra's lips curved in that subtle smile he had come to love. "The miscommunication that morning when you found me sleeping across your chest, it seems so distant now. A lifetime ago." Scott agreed, looking down at Orion, who had drifted to sleep against his chest, his tiny hand curled around one of Lyra's fingers. "Though I'm glad you explained yourself instead of just leaving." "As am I," Lyra said softly. "Among my people there is a belief that certain souls are meant to find each other across the void between worlds. Perhaps the universe arranged our meeting knowing what could grow from it." Scott wasn't sure if he believed in such cosmic orchestration, but looking at his improvised family, his alien partner, and their hybrid son, he couldn't help feeling that something remarkable had aligned to bring them together. As the three of them stood in the morning light, Orion stirred slightly, his crest rippling, as he sensed both his parents' emotions without need for empathic pollen. He would grow up between worlds, a bridge between species, the physical embodiment of connection across differences. And Scott, who had once valued his solitude and order above all else, found that he couldn't imagine a better fate than navigating this uncharted territory together. "Come," Lyra said gently, tugging him toward the door. "The family awaits." Family. The word had never held such wonder, such possibility. Scott followed her inside, carrying their son, ready to continue building their unique household. One that had begun with a startling awakening and evolved into something neither of them could have predicted, but both now treasured beyond measure.